Greetings. Welcome to day 6 of CIS Introduction to Literature. I've been recording a lot of these videos today, and it's starting to get to me a little bit, but I will carry on. Anyway, today for day 6, we are looking at a little activity I call Tracing the Ceremony. And in an attempt to get through a lot of important parts in the book, I laid these out for you, and this could be useful information for you. And in terms of, the first 90-some pages are kind of Tayo's problems and how the PTSD is affecting him. And then around that point is when he meets Batoni, and then things start to improve as Batoni essentially gives him a prophecy, right? And he talks about you got to look for the woman, and you got to look for the stars, and you got to look for the cattle. Right, and so this is if you're looking about how he changes or the information about the story, how as he remembers the story, then he's able to heal and move forward. This would be useful information for you. I'm going to break this up over 2 days, so you're going to watch the first half of this on day 6, and then you'll watch the second half on day 7. And I have one more thing for you to do tomorrow. So again, I would certainly recommend jotting notes down. I'm giving you a whole bunch of stuff for your papers, and you just gotta take it. So anyway, open up to page 93, please. Now, this is a couple things. The sunrise poem, prayer, and it said on page 93, he knew that holy men had their ways during the dry spells. People said they climbed to the trails. When they came back down, they would tell the people it was time to dance for rain. Josiah never told them much about praying, except that it should be something that he felt down inside himself. Now, if you remember when K'ush talked to him and talked about how the words have to be exactly the same and said in exactly the same way, and if we make any changes, it could cause great damage, all this stuff, Josiah is showing him a different way, and Batoni later confirms this, that the most important thing when praying is that you feel it, and that it is meaningful to you. So, that last summer before the war, so before he goes off with Rocky and before Rocky dies and Josiah dies, he got up before dawn and rode the bay mare south to the spring in the narrow canyon. I talked about pastoral writing. There's some really good stuff here, especially if you've been to the desert Southwest. Now, as he goes to the spring, this is showing him that there is water all the time, right? And even if conditions are bad and even if there is drought, there's springs that never dry up, right? So as he's doing this on page 94, the things he did seemed right, as he imagined with his heart the rituals the cloud priest performed before a drought. Now, these springs came from deep within the earth, the springs that never dry up. The people relied upon them, even when the sky was barren and the winds were hot and dusty. Now, if you want to write the paper about the stories, this is some good information here, because at this point, and in terms of, droughts happen when people forget, and when people forget the stories, when he went to war, he did. Remember, he dammed the rain and all that stuff. But this is before he went, and he's seeing evidence of the stories in nature, right? Now, he does this again later, right, as he starts to follow kind of Batoni's advice. And it said, Spider came out first. She drank from the edge of the pool, careful to keep her delicate egg sacs on her abdomen out of the water. And then we go from seeing the spider crawling along the edge of the water to the story of Spider Woman and Sun Man and gambling to win back the rain, right? Now, so this is evidence of the stories, right? And he's seeing them in nature, which is reminding him of him, right? Now, we kind of jump back and forth between what he has been taught in terms of traditional beliefs and then on what he's taught in school. In school, the science teacher had explained what superstition was and then held up the science textbook for the class to see true source of explanations. Now, when she says explaining what superstition is, that would be explaining a lot of Tayo's beliefs, right? Now, on page 95, we get more evidence of the stories. This would be useful story stuff. He turned. Everywhere he looked, he saw a world made of stories. The long ago, time immemorial stories, as Grandma called them. It was a world alive, always changing and moving, and if you knew where to look, you could see it. So, sometimes almost imperceptible, like the motion of the stars across the sky. Now, he sees characters or entities from the poem itself. He slowly rode over the groves of dry sunflower stalks left from their better years. It was then he saw a bright green hummingbird shimmering above the dry sandy ground, flying higher and higher until it was only a bright speck. As long as the hummingbird had not abandoned the land, somewhere there were still flowers, and they could all go on, right? Now, in terms of the story in the poem, the story of the hummingbird going and rescuing and saving the people, here, in terms of being a reminder that even though there's a drought, if you see a hummingbird, that means there has to be flowers somewhere, right? So things are still growing somewhere, and that gives him a source of hope too. Okay, going on. Page 98 to 100. Now, this is when, so Josiah had given a note for Tayo to give to Night Swan, and I don't know whether he intended Night Swan to seduce Tayo and have an affair, whether he intended that to happen, which is weird. I like my uncle, but I don't think he would ever do such a thing. Anyway, these are characters, as I said, Night Swan, who seem to have some kind of mythical elements to them, right? As if they might be out of the stories themselves. So on page 98, somewhere from another room, he heard the clock ticking slowly and distinctly as if the years, the centuries were lost in that sound, right? This is the type of language that shows that kind of mythical quality. Her long brown hair was curled and piled high in her head in long ringlets, the style of some past time. She did not look old or young to him then. She was like the rain and the wind. Age had no relation to her. Okay, now this is further evidence, kind of mythical quality to her. Now, when he shows up, Tayo shows up. I've been watching you for a long time, she said. I saw the color of your eyes. Tayo did not look at her. Mexican eyes, he said. The other kids used to tease me. No, because his father was Mexican. We had Kuush saying his father was white, right? And I've never quite reconciled what's going on with his father. Unless they're lumping Mexican people in with white people. And I'm not entirely sure. When Batoni relates his story to Tayo about his grandmother, it was with a Mexican woman, right? And so I'm not totally sure what to make of that. But Mexican eyes, he said. The other kids used to tease me. I always wish I had dark eyes like other people. When they look at me, they remember things that happened. My mother, his throat felt tight. He had not talked about this with anyone before. Now, Night Swan is going to give him similar advice to Batoni about change, right? The people are making fun of him because he looks different, and that the way he looks is evidence of the change that's taken place culturally. But what Night Swan's going to tell him, and Batoni is telling him, is that things have always been changing, right? Nothing has ever remained static. She shook her head slowly. They're afraid, Tayo. They feel something happening. They can see something happening around them, and it scares them. They think that if their children have the same color of skin, the same color of eyes, that nothing's changing. She laughed softly. They're fools. They blame us, the ones who look different. That way they don't have to think about what's happened inside themselves. Then she goes on, you don't have to understand what is happening, but remember this day, you'll recognize it later, you're a part of it, right? Now, she is. Because one, she's the first person to note his eyes and start to instill in him the idea that a mixed background can be a source of strength and power, right? As opposed to something that he is made fun of by other characters for. On page 101 and 102, we get some fly stuff, right? And we saw this in the Animals and Theme and Ceremony essay. And it says it's talking about flies, right? And a game when Tayo was playing, when he was a kid, was killing flies and putting them in a pile. And that is a fun game that every young kid has played at one time or another. I used to play it all the time, and I would keep my piles from game to game until it was one big pile. But our teacher said so. They say they're bad and carry disease. Well, I didn't go to school much, so I don't know much about that, you see. A long time ago, way back in time immemorial, the mother of the people got angry at them for the way they were behaving. Now, this, in the time immemorial stories, these are the traditional stories that go back a long time. People have always been misbehaving, right? People have always been forgetting. People have always been forgetting their traditions, and then they're punished for it, and then they need to go and set things right. And so even though Tayo feels like he's undergoing something brand new, what we're saying is here, we've seen it with the poems of the animals, and we've heard it with the story here, these things have always been happening. The animals disappeared, the plants disappeared, no rain came for a long time. It was the green bottle fly who went to her asking forgiveness for the people. And you could see, in one sense, Tayo was doing something similar. The poem and the story are not a one-to-one analogy. It's not a direct comparison, but the stories do kind of mirror each other. Okay, now on page 102, so Tayo's killing all those flies, and because he had forgotten the story. Droughts happen when people forget, right? And so he feels bad, and Josiah says, next time just remember the story, right? So he said, I don't think the flies are going to be angry at you. You just forgot, now remember. But then the next paragraph down on 102, we see him forget again, right? And that forgetting is what leads to him damning the rain and the drought. But in the jungle, he'd not been able to endure the flies that had crawled over Rocky. They'd enraged him. He'd cursed their sticky feet and wet mouths when he could reach them, and he'd smash them between their hands. Okay, now going on, 117. Now, on page 108, 109, 110, 111, this is about Tayo's childhood, right? And you might even want to just note those pages, 109 to 1012. Tayo's life was rough growing up, right? He didn't really have anyone to take care of him, and he didn't really have anyone to look after him, and he really grew up a lot on his own. I'm going to make part 2 of this video because I'm running out of space, but I'm going to keep going for another minute. So we saw this is why, because he was kind of abandoned by his mom and never really taken care of him, he's never really had anybody until he started to live with Josiah, right? And Josiah was the only person who ever really cared for him and took care of him, which is why when he felt like he let him down, and Josiah ended up dying as a result of this, that he feels really bad and he feels like he's to blame for it. Okay, so after this, I'd like you to watch part 2 of this video. I'm going to go through another section or 2, and then we'll watch the rest of this as your assignment tomorrow on day 7 of ceremony. Thank you.